Okay, here's something we all kind of think we're good at, right? Reading people.
Hmm.
Spotting if someone's not being straight with you or knowing how they feel just from a look. Maybe you've seen shows like Lie to Me and thought, yeah, I can spot those little
It's
tells.
a really common idea,
Yeah.
definitely. We see, a gesture, a certain look, how someone's standing,
Yeah,
and we feel like, okay, I know what's going on there. We make these really quick judgments.
exactly. And for you listening, someone who wants to get up to speed quickly, but also really understand some fascinating, complex human stuff, this is a big one. How good are we really at this thing we think is like a superpower?
Well, that's where our sources come in today.
Mm.
We've got a really great stack here. It goes from, practical tips people share about body language all the way to some pretty deep academic research.
Yeah, we're talking about some cutting edge stuff being used to study this, like motion capture suits, virtual reality simulations, studies using machine learning to look at facial movements, and even just the basic psychology of how we form impressions in the first place.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then is to take all of that, all these different sources, and really unpack this whole idea of reading people. We want to show you what the science is actually saying, maybe explore why our gut feeling might lead us astray sometimes.
Hmm.
And we're going to break it down from, well, quite a few different angles based on this material. We'll try to really explain the methods scientists use, walk you through some, frankly, surprising findings, and just give you a clearer picture piece by piece. No rushing.
Okay, sounds good. So maybe the best place to start is just contrasting that popular belief with what the science is actually finding.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's unpack it. So the common idea, and yeah, media definitely plays a role, plus just our own feelings,
Mm,
is that we can, easily tell if someone's lying or feeling something strong just by watching their nonverbal cues.
great.
You see someone fidget, maybe they look away, maybe they're sweating a bit, and you just feel like, okay, they're hiding something or they're super nervous.
That intuition, it feels really strong. But the scientific finding is pretty different. Study after study shows that when people try to detect deception just from nonverbal behavior, well, their accuracy is often barely better than chance.
Really? Like what kind of numbers are we talking?
We're consistently seeing averages around, say, 54% accuracy. That's hardly better than just flipping a coin.
Wow. Okay. So even though we feel confident, we're basically just guessing a lot of the time.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting. One of our sources specifically calls out a lot of the behavioral detection methods used today, maybe in security or something,
Hmm.
noting that many of them actually lack solid scientific backing. They might rely more on sort of opinion or old ideas rather than hard data.
Okay, so if our gut isn't that reliable and some common methods aren't even scientifically sound, then what are we even looking at, or what do we think we're looking at? What are these signals people focus on?
Right. So when people talk about reading someone, they're usually focusing on a few different things. There's body language, obviously, gestures, posture, how people move.
Okay.
Then there are facial expressions. And some sources get really specific, talking about micro expressions, those super brief flashes of feeling on the face.
Right, I've heard of those.
Yeah. And then there's eye contact or lack thereof. And also the tone of voice, all nonverbal stuff.
And underlying that is this sort of intuitive idea that our emotions cause physical changes, right?
Okay.
Like if you're angry, maybe your face gets red, you clench your fists. If you're scared, maybe you tremble a bit.
Exactly. The material does mention that link emotions trigger physiological arousal, and evolution has kind of wired us to show that physically in certain ways. And yeah, microexpressions get highlighted as those really quick involuntary facial displays, like half a second to maybe 4 seconds long. So fast.
Very fast.
Yeah.
And supposedly linked to genuine emotion and hard to fake because they happen so quickly.
But here's where it gets really tricky, right? And this is fascinating. The interpretation part. Even if those signals are there, reading them correctly seems incredibly subjective.
Oh, absolutely. This is a huge issue. People look at the exact same cue and come away with completely different interpretations. Let's take nervousness. That's one people often mention as a tell.
Yeah, my first thought is, okay, nervous probably means they're lying, hiding something.
And yeah, some people definitely interpret it that way, and some sources mention it. But one source explicitly points out that nervousness is seen contradictorily. Some people see it and think, deception, they're nervous about getting caught.
Okay.
But others see that exact same nervous behavior and think, oh, they must be telling the truth. They're nervous because they feel vulnerable, or they really want me to believe them and they're anxious. So the same fidgeting could mean liar to one person and honest but anxious to another. That makes it incredibly difficult. It really highlights the subjectivity.
It really does. And this is also where our own biases, our mental shortcuts, our stereotypes, they all jump in. Often, they can completely override whatever behavior the person is actually showing.
How so?
Well, the sources talk about how our judgments can be swayed by really surface level things like what someone's wearing, their gender, if we perceive them as having a disability. Even things like race or nationality, according to some studies mentioned,
Hmm.
we might apply these unconscious biases without even realizing it.
Leading to judgments that aren't fair or accurate, regardless of the nonverbals?
Exactly. It's like our brains aren't just objectively observing behavior, they're filtering it through our existing beliefs and expectations, kind of filling in the gaps based on maybe stereotypes rather than what's actually in front of us.
So we're not seeing clearly, we're seeing through our own lens.
In many ways, yes. We use these mental shortcuts heuristics, which we can talk about more explicitly in a bit, that often lead us down the wrong path without us even knowing.
Okay, so given all that subjectivity and bias,
Yeah.
what about looking for like inconsistencies? That's advice I've heard a lot. Watch for when what someone says doesn't match their body language. Like saying yes,
Yeah.
but shaking their head no.
Yeah, that tip does come up in one of the sources. Pay attention to those mismatches between the verbal and the nonverbal. It feels logical, doesn't it? If the signals conflict, something feels off.
Right. If the different channels aren't sending the same message, something must be going on, surely.
That's the intuitive appeal, definitely. But we have to immediately kind of temper that idea with research findings suggesting that lying doesn't always lead to these consistent, obvious, nonverbal changes that look different from telling the truth. The whole idea that liars just behave fundamentally differently from truth tellers in ways we can reliably spot, well, it might be a bit flawed. Different psychological theories approach this differently too, like comparing ideas about self-presentation versus multi-factor theories of deception cues. So even looking for inconsistency isn't like a magic bullet.
Okay, so even that seemingly solid piece of advice isn't foolproof.
Mhm.
What about just trusting your gut then?
Mhm.
That feeling when something just seems wrong. Can we rely on that?
Intuition. Yeah, this taps into that idea of unconscious processing. The thinking goes, maybe if something just feels off, your subconscious is picking up on subtle cues or mismatches that you can't quite put your finger on consciously.
It's the classic advice, isn't it? Trust your gut when judging people.
It's very appealing, and some theories have suggested that maybe our unconscious mind is actually better at spotting deception than our conscious analytical brain. But one study that our sources explicitly mention actually tested this. They encouraged some participants to rely on intuition, others to consciously deliberate, and the result, using intuition did not improve lie detection accuracy compared to conscious thinking. In both cases, accuracy just stayed stuck around chance levels.
So another appealing idea that doesn't seem to hold up under scrutiny.
Okay.
Okay. If our intuition isn't reliable and focusing on these traditional subjective cues doesn't really work,
Huh?
how on earth do scientists study this properly? How do they get past all this subjectivity?
Right. This is where the sources get into some really cool, innovative methods. To get beyond just having people watch each other and give their opinions, researchers are using technology to get objective measurements. For instance, one study we looked at explicitly used motion capture technology.
You mean like the suits they use for CGI in movies with all the little balls on them?
Exactly like that. Specifically, they mentioned using an XSense suit, which has, I think, 17 sensors placed on different parts of the body. And this tech allows for really precise, objective measurement of movement. It gathers data on things like how much each body segment moves, the exact position of the body's center of mass, overall speed, cadence, which is steps per minute, step length. Just incredibly detailed data on movement.
Data you could never capture just by watching.
No way! It removes that subjective interpretation layer for movement. They also explicitly used virtual reality in some studies
VR.
to create more realistic scenarios. Like, they simulated an airport security checkpoint. So you put participants in a situation that feels kind of real, maybe a bit high stakes, but the researchers still have complete control over everything that happens and can measure responses precisely.
Okay, so creating controlled but relevant environments.
Clever.
Yeah. And another tech mentioned explicitly is eye tracking. This lets researchers see exactly where people are looking down to the millisecond when they're trying to figure out if someone is being deceptive.
So you can see if looking at the face versus the hands makes a difference. Precisely. Plus, there's the use of machine learning algorithms. They're using AI to analyze dynamic facial features, how the face moves over time, and trying to see if those patterns can be linked to things like personality traits.
Okay, so scientists are definitely using some serious tech to try and get objective data here, which leads to the big question. What is this data from these advanced objective methods? What is it actually telling us about reading people or detecting lies?
And this is where the results get really interesting and, frankly, quite surprising. They really challenge a lot of common assumptions. Those studies using motion capture in the VR airport settings, they explicitly found no significant reliable differences in the nonverbal behaviors they measured between the people who were being honest and the people who were told to be deceptive.
Wait, none. Based on all those precise measurements of how they moved, walked, shifted their weight,
Yeah.
no reliable difference.
Based on the objective data collected in those specific experiments, that's what they found. No consistent liar's walk or anything like that. And similarly, response latency, basically, how long it took participants to answer questions, also showed no significant difference between the lying and truth-telling conditions in those scenarios.
That really flies in the face of the popular idea that there are these obvious nonverbal tells, especially in situations like security screening.
Mhm.
The objective data just didn't find them reliably.
It explicitly did not in these particular studies, yes.
Okay, so what about the eye tracking then? Where our eyes go when we're trying to figure someone out? What did those studies explicitly show? Did looking in the right place help?
The eye tracking findings were, well, they were interesting, but they didn't exactly simplify things. What the data showed was that where people looked the most often, say, focusing a lot on the person's head, or maybe their legs didn't necessarily connect with how accurate they were overall at detecting deception.
So just staring intently at someone's face or their potentially fidgety feet didn't actually help people get better at telling lies from truth.
Not reliably. In terms of overall accuracy, no. But there was this really specific, kind of counterintuitive finding mentioned explicitly in one study.
Go on.
It found that people who spent more time fixating specifically on the person's left hand actually showed slightly increased accuracy in detecting deception in that experiment. But people who fixated more on the left arm showed reduced accuracy.
The left hand versus the left arm. That is incredibly specific and weird. Why the left hand?
The sources don't really give a definitive explanation for why that specific finding emerged in that experiment. And it's important to remember, even with that odd correlation, the overall accuracy in the study still hovered around chance levels.
Ah, okay.
So what it really does is explicitly highlight just how ambiguous cues can be. Even where we look might be linked to accuracy in strange, unexpected ways in a controlled setting, but it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that overall, it's really hard to do better than guessing.
This really leads us nicely into a key psychological idea that helps explain why we might latch onto unreliable cues or interpret things so subjectively. It's this concept that our brains,
Well, they like to take shortcuts.
exactly. This is grounded in the well-established idea that humans often act as cognitive misers. Basically, we're naturally a bit reluctant to spend a huge amount of mental energy, especially on complex, fuzzy, social judgments, like trying to figure out someone's true intentions or feelings.
So we're mentally lazy when it comes to judging people. Is that fair?
Maybe efficient is a kinder word, but yeah, essentially we look for ways to save cognitive effort. We rely heavily on these mental shortcuts or heuristics. The sources explicitly mention a couple, like the availability heuristic.
Peaches.
That's where our judgment gets skewed by information that's easily recalled or readily available in our minds, like something we just saw in the news. Or the anchoring heuristic, where our judgment gets stuck on or anchored to the very first piece of information we get about someone. Okay, so if the first thing you hear about someone is negative, that anchor might just color how you see everything else they do or say afterwards.
Precisely. And we also explicitly lean on our pre-existing schemas, our mental frameworks and stereotypes to make quick judgments. Sometimes we're not even consciously aware we're doing it. These shortcuts heavily influence how we read others, but often they lead to interpretations that are biased or just plain wrong. It becomes less about carefully decoding the signals they're actually sending and more about quickly slotting them into a pre-existing mental box.
Which, as we kind of touched on earlier, is a massive problem if those mental boxes, those stereotypes, are inaccurate or harmful.
Exactly. It really helps explain why subjectivity and bias are just so deeply ingrained in this whole process of trying to read people.
Okay, so for our last angle here, let's shift gears a bit. If trying to spot specific tells is so problematic, maybe effectively reading people isn't really about that specific skill at all. Maybe it's about something broader, like empathy or emotional intelligence.
Yeah, this perspective suggests that really understanding others might be less about becoming a human lie detector and more about developing general interpersonal skills. The sources explicitly bring up the importance of emotional intelligence, or EQ.
Which involves.
Well, it's generally understood as the ability to, first, understand and manage your own emotions, and second, to recognize and understand emotions in other people. Explicitly being aware of your own feelings and how they affect you, and being able to tune into others.
So knowing myself helps me understand you better, potentially.
It certainly can, and empathy is explicitly mentioned as crucial here too, which isn't just feeling sorry for someone, but actively listening without jumping to conclusions, making a real effort to see things from their perspective, and being genuinely attuned to their emotional state and maybe their underlying needs or frustrations.
This feels less like trying to catch someone in a lie and more like just genuinely trying to connect and understand where another person is coming from.
It really is. And while skills like empathy might not necessarily make you better at spotting a specific nonverbal cue of deception, the sources suggest they are absolutely foundational for truly understanding people's motivations, what makes them tick, what they need.
Yeah.
One source explicitly talks about empathy in leadership, things like truly listening, considering how decisions impact people, how that builds trust and connection. It's about understanding the whole person, their context, not just hunting for tiny, potentially meaningless behavioral tells.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
And it feels like a much healthier, more constructive way to interact with people than constantly trying to second guess them or look for signs of deception in a totally different frame for what reading someone could mean.
It explicitly shifts the focus, doesn't it, from trying to detect dishonesty to trying to build genuine understanding.
So let's bring this all together. After diving into all these sources, what's the main message here? What should you, our listener, take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway, looking across all this material, is that the common idea that we can easily and accurately read people just by watching their nonverbal cues,
Hmm.
well, it's largely a myth. It's explicitly shown to be a much more complex, messy process than we tend to think.
Yeah.
It's riddled with subjective interpretation. The signals themselves aren't always reliable or even consistently there, and our own minds constantly get in the way with biases and shortcuts.
And the research that tries to be objective using tech like motion capture and eye tracking, it explicitly backs this up, right?
Yeah.
They found that those traditional nonverbal cues didn't reliably separate liars from truth tellers in their experiments. Accuracy just stayed around chance levels, even with those weird specific findings about eye gaze.
Exactly. So understanding these complexities, understanding how difficult this actually is, can hopefully help you approach your interactions with other people with maybe more realistic expectations.
Mhm.
You might explicitly rely less on trying to spot those specific tells, which could be misleading anyway, and maybe become more aware of your own potential biases when you're forming impressions.
So instead of trying to be a detective, maybe just focus on actually listening and trying to understand the other person.
That certainly seems to be the more constructive path and the one more supported by the difficulties highlighted in these sources.
It does leave you with a final thought, though, doesn't it? If explicitly spotting nonverbal signals isn't the answer, and even our best technology struggles to find consistent, reliable differences, then maybe truly understanding another person relies less on decoding their tics and gestures and more on something completely different,
Like what?
like maybe shared experiences, building actual trust over time, or maybe just explicitly accepting that human communication